Namaskar. Welcome to episode 29 of Satyagraha series. Every Saturday, we try to bring forth environmental, social, and political issues that impacts us or that has the potential to impact us. This week too, we thought of organizing a dialogue session on how digital media is influencing our behavior, is influencing our habits, in the process making us vulnerable, and how if this particular situation is perpetuated unchecked, how it could be damaging not only to us but to the very fabric of democracy. Let me give you a little case study to make you understand how digital media and politics are related. It was the year 2016 when Mr. Donald Trump became the president of America. After he took power, there were news that his political campaigners have utilized the service of an IT firm by the name of Cambridge Analytica. Now, apparently, Cambridge Analytica they hosted many apps on the Facebook, and through these apps, they got the information, the user information, then how they are engaging with the internet. They got the information of the friends of those users of how they are engaging with the Facebook. Now they compile this information, and through these informations, they kind of promoted some targeted campaigns to influence their behavior, to influence their voting pattern towards Donald Trump. Now, if you are watching this video, that means you are also on some social media or Google, social media like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and you also might have shared some information willingly, or some information is being extracted from you without your knowledge. In this session, we will try to understand that how this social media, these social media houses, they are influencing how we use internet, how they're influencing our behavior, uh, internet usage behavior. And to speak more about it, we have our eminent panelist from a Bangalore based NGO, IT for Change. Now, let me give you a brief introduction about what they do. So, IT for Change, it aims for a society in which digital technologies contribute to human rights, social justice, and equity. They are engaged in research, policy, and advocacy to prevent data concentration among large globalized players, promoting and integrating tailor-made decentralized technologies in order to effect social change with a special focus on social justice and gender equality. So we have with us Mr. Parminder Jeet Singh, who is the Executive Director of IT for Change. I welcome you, Parminder ji. And we also have Miss Anita Gurumurthy. She is the Executive Director of IT for Change. I welcome you, Anita ji, and thank you for taking out time for your busy schedule to give us some information and enlighten us about the damaging impact of social media. Now, to start with, I have my first question with Mr. Parminder ji. Parminder ji, would you please tell our viewers that what is this data, what is this information, and why companies they are so interested in our personal data, and what are they doing with it? So over to you, Parminder ji.
Uh, Thank you, Ankit. Probably you could not have started with a better question. And let me answer to the best of my ability. And I think this is central to all the issues which we will discuss. What is data? I mean, people say somebody is taking our data, and you are not very clear what's the problem there, right? Because, but some other people say no, no, privacy is a good thing, and privacy violation is bad, and then you say, oh well, perhaps they shouldn't do it. But when you are alone, you just say, okay, doesn't matter. Let me, I mean, you don't even understand what's the issue there. Now, you would understand the issue better if I try to answer your question directly, Ankit, that what is this data? They're not taking your data, they're taking intelligence about you. Because data is not a valuable resource unless it is shifted into intelligence. Data is otherwise Excel sheets or more than Excel sheets, whatever bits and bytes it is. But they extract out of data very granular intelligence about you. Sometimes that kind of intelligence, which is more than what you know about yourself. Now, moment we hear that somebody else owns intelligence about us, that immediately makes us feel uncomfortable. So basically, what the companies are taking and collecting in a systematic manner is intelligence about you as an individual, as a group. You have a certain sexuality, you have certain friends you hang over with, you have a certain demographic profile, you come from certain region. What people of this region, what people of this sexuality, this demographic profile do. Uh, uh, that's the intelligence somebody else possesses, and you can understand the danger of somebody possessing intelligence about you, about the society you live in, about your social relationships. So that's the problem. That's the problem about somebody taking our data. So I don't know whether, Ankit, you want to go to another question or want me to carry on, but whichever way.
Okay. I think it was you are right when you say, okay, they're not taking data, but they're taking intelligence about your behavior. So my question is, why the companies are doing that, and what are they doing with it?
Okay. I'll have to go even level higher. And excuse me, because this looks difficult, but that's the only way to really understand what's happening. Industrial revolution. If I ask you, what is industrial revolution? Industrial revolution was that human beings tamed physical power. If you really look at it, how do you define pre-industrial age? In the pre-industrial age, the physical power was always either with human beings or with animals. You had animal driven carriages, animals doing agriculture work, or human beings doing directly work. So these were the only places where the physical power was. You may use some tools to make things a little less extraneous, but the physical power was with human beings or animals. And then the industrial revolution came and brought this thing called machine. What is a machine? Machine is something which embodied physical power for some first time. Therefore, the physical power went out of animals and human beings into some outside thing. And that changed everything. That's called industrial revolution. It changed the geopolitics, geoeconomics. It was resulted in colonization. All the world we live in is because physical power was embodied in machines. Now look at it, what's happening now. Physical power went to machines, but intelligence was still with human beings. It was human beings who directed the machine, either directly or through organizational systems, which were the locus of human knowledge and intelligence, and through that we directed our machines. But what is happening in digitalization and through data is that intelligence as the resource is now going into a machine. So even earlier physical power went to a machine and we called it machine, and now intelligence also goes into a machine, which we may call as artificial intelligence, digital intelligence, or anything. Now when you ask what are they doing, like whoever controlled mechanical power, whoever controlled industry, ruled the world at the time of the late 17th 18th centuries and called industrialization. Whoever controls the new resource of data and intelligence will control everything. That person will control agriculture. And actually, I've just written a statement that the farmers who are on the road, and if you really look at the farm bills closely, there's a lot of technical and technology platform things in it. Basically, this is also that few corporates will come and own the agriculture intelligence. And through that agriculture intelligence will direct the farmers as agents of an outsourced intelligence. We keep on outsourcing intelligence. I mean, there were time would come that even a barber's appointment, which Ankit or somebody wants to make, is made through an intelligence system who knows what kind of things you want, whether you are free on those days, etc., etc. So we are outsourcing our intelligence on an individual level, as a group level, and as a system level. And that becomes the most important resource. And whoever owns intelligence is at the top of the value chains. It is not the owner of industries who's at the top of the value chain. It is not even the owner of intellectual property who's on the top of the value chains, but it is the owner of intelligence of our systems, who's at the top of the value chain. So whoever comes to own intelligence rules the world. And right now it is just US and some in China. So that's what they do with intelligence. And then, of course, the media is also controlled in a similar manner because they control intelligence. Ankit, you are mute.
Oh, sorry. So whoever owns the intelligence is basically will rule the world, right? Will rule all the important decisions, the political, the economical, and like the agriculture intelligence you have mentioned, right? So I want to know in present socio-economic conditions, is there any monopolistic market structure of social media?
Yeah, of course. I mean, social media we know is monopolistic. You have Facebook, you have WhatsApp, which is associated with Facebook, Instagram, which I don't use, but is powerful among the young. So of course it is monopolistic, and the reason is, and you will find it strange. Machines had certain reason that machines operate at certain scale. They operate at scale of factories, and therefore there is a certain lumping together of productive power, because you cannot have a sewing machine at your home with small one, but if you want to have a big machine, you better set up an industrial shed. And there was sudden concentration of power through this artifact called a factory, because large scale consumption production took place through a factory, and therefore there is a certain concentration of power which industrialization created. Intelligence has this hugely monopolizing tendency of its own. When we consider that intelligence is the central resource of the new world, look at it. If your body had two brains, one is the head and one, I don't know, in my stomach or somewhere, it will be a very difficult proposition to have the body controlled by two brains. Therefore, one brain is always better than two brains. Now, this is true of all intelligence, transportation intelligence. Uber is one intelligence. It's always better than having 8 intelligences. So intelligence has this inherent tendency to become monopolies. And this is the reason there is a monopoly of Facebook, there's a monopoly of Google. Earlier, at least even in cars, etc., you had Mercedes and Daimler, but you had Ford and GM and Toyota. So there was some division of power. But as you know, that in the case of digital and intelligence business, it's one Google in its area, one Facebook in its area, more or less one Uber. And wherever there were more, like Uber and Didi merged in China, Uber and Grab merged in Southeast Asia, because it's like, why have two? If there are two brains, if we put them together, you probably have an efficiency which is 20-fold. Now, when the economic force is so strong for merger, you obviously will merge the two brains. So yes, there is a monopoly in almost every intelligence business, and so is with media.
Okay. Thank you, Parminder ji. Now, I would request Anita ji to please enlighten us that how these social media platforms, they are influencing our behavioral patterns. Anita ji, over to you.
Yes, thanks very much. In fact, as a segue to what Parminder just said, what I want to actually say is that in the 1960s, a school associated with Marxism came up with the idea of the social factory, right? This is a concept that might be very familiar to those who've been following these autonomous neo-Marxist movements. The whole idea is that society becomes a factory, right? And that is, I think, a very important bridge to what we need to understand about how data is harvested, and harvested data is used to study behavior, and behavior is then monetized, right? The monetization of social behavior, which is based on society as factory. So what I'd like to do is really lay out some such structural truths and facts about how digital media works. I'm going to try my slide share and I hope it works. Yeah. Okay, you have to tell me if this is.
Yeah, we can see
that. We can see it. Yes.
All right. So what yeah. So another way to describe this, and there's a lot of scholarship in this area, which really talks about the new automated public sphere. So the difference between media and media. So a lot of times people do ask, right? There was the cable TV revolution. And before the television came, it was supposed to be a tool for education. Of course, sooner than later, it was a part of the instruments of capitalism. Then, of course, the cable TV revolution. And then you actually see how in South Asia, for instance, there are certain media houses that control most of the channels in cable TV. So similarly, one asks the question, is the public sphere different and are these companies different? And I think that's the answer we are going to seek. And what Parminder just said is going to lay the foundations that, yes, capitalism may be similar and maybe adapting itself to newer and newer modes of production based on what the new factors of production are. And in this instance, AI, artificial intelligence or digital intelligence becomes a factor of production, but that results in a public sphere or a media space that is controlled by monopolies that is automated. So what are the characteristics of the new automated public sphere? An important thing is that they're based on a certain many-to-many kind of context, which proceeds from anonymity, virality, and fragmentation. So which is why you can actually have a particular identity on Instagram, a different identity, and of course, debates like the right to be forgotten, right? Facts about you that were perhaps, relevant at one point in time continue to remain on the internet. And that has led to very, very long-winded legal debates about should that information continue to remain in the public sphere. So there is a considerable manipulation really of news and views and opinions through algorithmic profiling. So if you buy 5 things on Amazon, then it will tell you what 10 other things you should be buying. Similarly, if you view certain things on Netflix, you will always get nudged towards what else you should be watching. And the success for these platforms or social media for being online and continuing to be monopolies is virality. So insofar as a message or a particular piece of content can multiply itself manifold and lead to clicks and multiple more clicks and lead to likes and multiple more likes, then the social media is happy. It really doesn't bother very much as to what the nature of that content is. But what we need to understand is that underlying all of this is society's proclivity towards certain form of politics and certain ways of looking at the world, right? So those ideologies that are already dominant, those ideologies that find traction in society, bias, discrimination, prejudice against minorities, etc., seem to pick up much more. And this runs the profit considerations rather than the democratizing potential of digital media, which of course exists. And that's something we can come to later. So we all live in filter bubbles and we like to listen to people who sound like us, consume news that we like. And that the danger of that is much more, which is the polarization that Ankit, you were also referring to. And this kind of filter bubble, I think, is really about refining the theory of who you are. The social dilemma, that film really puts it out very, very well as to how, there is so much knowledge about oneself that is vested in the machines and in the algorithms that it's scary how the algorithm knows you better than you yourself. So this tends to blur the lines between facts and opinions. So it's extremely difficult to figure out, if you like something, whether that's your opinion, and which is why many people on Twitter add the disclaimer that, my views are mine, they're not my organizations. I'm just using Twitter not as opinions. If I forward a tweet, it doesn't mean that I subscribe to the content on the tweet, because it's extremely difficult to make out the difference between fact and truth and reality. And these are part of the characteristics of new media. And I'm coming now to a very important part. The way virality is concentrated builds on top of historical exclusions, biases, and discriminations. It's not an accident, it's not simply that the algorithms pick up on a very neutral territory. They don't. And a study actually, and many studies have reflected how very, very little content occupies a very large part of the digital public sphere. And then the other content bunch really jostles to find its space. So some content really amplifies. It's also true that what gets amplified and what is really doing the rounds is not necessarily polarized in the very same way. There is actually strength, and there is ideological power, which is fueled by financial power, which is fueled by political power. And all of that actually locks together in targeting certain caste groups, religious groups, certain gender and queer groups. And this is something that has come to the fore increasingly in the past couple of years. And what you're looking at now is a study by Equality Labs, and they actually show you exactly how polarization of a particular kind takes place in India. This is equally true about women in politics, so what we are finding in the research that IT for Change is doing is that the gains that the feminist movements have made for the past couple of decades is really slipping. This is not only in the realm of socioeconomic realities like nutritional status, work participation rates of women, etc., but also the public sphere participation of women. So it's really a double whammy for women. To be online is easy. It's an aspiration for every young person, every young person who's female or who's a gender minority. But to be online and to really be resilient is a very big challenge, because you could continuously be abused. And the nature of abuse is usually defined by the community standards of these social media. But the research that I'm pointing out to, done by Amnesty, shows that other than abusive content, which is defined as abusive by the particular social platform, there's problematic content. And women in public political life, especially, tend to face this kind of religious slurs and other kinds of attacks. So finally, I really want to conclude by taking you to a few areas of policy change and cultural change. The last one is about culture. Unless you have a society that aspires towards um, the original Habermasian idea of the public sphere, where you could debate, you could deliberate, we are going to end up feeding the algorithms things that we don't want to feed them. But the attention economy, which loves virality, is going to perpetuate the content that we don't like. And this is the section I'm going to come to, is the whole idea of the algorithmic programming. How do we make algorithms accountable? We have to account for market interests. In India, Facebook has been towing the line of the political regime, more or less, because for Facebook, India is a very, very big market. It's the largest growing market, and it has its eye on many, many kinds of stakes, including, for instance, there are going to be WhatsApp storefronts on Jio, right? So these innovations and the stakes and the market interest that Facebook has in India is going to influence the way it navigates its relationship with the political masters. And there's no way content can be regulated by human beings. So algorithms are important to sort out bad content from good content. And I'm just showing you how many Google searches happen every day, how many blog posts are written every day. And human beings cannot be employed to do this, actually. So algorithms are used to flag content that is, for instance, discriminatory, or content that may be a religious slur, etc. What happens is, over time, especially after Cambridge Analytica, Facebook did a certain maybe a self-reflective exercise within, because there was a lot of discontent brewing from within the company, and it decided to put into its community standards very strong ideas of what content will be censored and will be flagged, right? And then it started releasing in 2018 the Transparency Report. In 2019, it started introducing a feature called "Why am I seeing this post?" So if any one of us wants to go to the right corner, there's a pull down button, and it will tell you why a post is being shown to you. We are not really aware about these things. And as we know, after the lynching and all of that in India, WhatsApp limited forwards to 5 chats at a time. But there's a problem. AI cannot sort everything out. you actually see this photograph of people who are Black. Google labeled Black people gorilla. And that was because the AI was not able to distinguish between human beings and animals. And Google said, oh my God, we are so sorry we did this. And we're working on long-term fixes. And more than 2 years later, which was in 2017, 2018, one of those fixes is simply saying we will erase gorillas out of our lexicon because AI is very hard to develop in that area. Policy is very important. This is the way in which the transparency report of Facebook is filed by Facebook in Germany, because Germany has a network enforcement law which says that you must show us exactly how you acted on content that was, for instance, propaganda material. So it's not only your own self-regulation that matters, but our laws, which is the NetzDG law, which is quite controversial because it seemed to be promoting censorship, but it has its upsides, which is that social media companies in Germany have to report very differently from the way they report in India. So India also has to start thinking about how to enforce these kind of regulatory standards on social media. So the takeaways is that national level content moderation seems to be important. They seem to be imminent. New intermediary liability guidelines, liability for intermediary social media companies are going to be issued anytime soon, but they need to be based on human rights. What is also important is that national level legislation is not enough because social media companies need to be governed globally, and we need to discuss the role of algorithms and AI globally. And we need to be sure that AI is not going to be out of the human loop. So AI has to be accountable. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neetaji. In your presentation, you have used two terminologies. One is monopolistic social medias, and other is democratizing of social media. So can you please briefly explain what these terms means?
Obviously, monopolistic media, like Parminder explained, is that in the era of networks, there is a first mover advantage, right? So if you get there first, then you tend to occupy all the nodes first. And once you occupy the nodes, you achieve a certain intelligence scale advantage. And that is why you become a monopoly, because you've gotten there, you have the data, you have the intelligence, and you capture the market. Now, it's possible that there are alternative ways by which we can look at media structures. It's not necessary that those who have the intelligence alone need to control the media sphere. So to democratize media structures, you have to think about breaking up social media companies in a very, very different way. You have to really start thinking about what are the possibilities to allow alternate media to flourish, in which case you might really have to think about federated social media structures, in which case then people will have a larger choice in the market to subscribe to different things that they would like to belong to. Of course, different platforms will have different functionalities. You might want to sacrifice a few functionalities in order to stay on certain platforms because you believe that those platforms don't discriminate, they do not manipulate, they do not perpetuate fake news. So that is the difference between monopolizing and democratizing media structures.
And you also mentioned that, okay, like after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the Facebook introduced some features in order to know, like, from like, why are we seeing this particular kind of an ad or post. So I want to know, like, see, it is a like initial stage. Like Facebook is quite new, and other social media handles are also quite new. So so of course, like they are bound to make some initial mistakes. So, but are they learning from the mistakes? Are they going for better, or is there some hidden agenda that which we don't know about?
There's no hidden agenda because the agenda is quite transparent. The agenda is to really have market power. In fact, very recently in October, when the Special Parliamentary Committee in India for IT summoned all these companies, Amazon initially declared that they do not have the wherewithal, they do not have the kind of bandwidth to be able to depute somebody to go and listen to the summons in parliament. Eventually, of course, they showed up. But the point is this, that the companies are so brazen, the big tech as they are called, and sometimes they are also called big five, and they are in different sectors, that their agenda is very clear. It is really to rule the world. And in terms of Mark Zuckerberg, he says, well, we made mistakes and we can learn from our mistakes. What it simply means is, insofar as we can entrench our market power, we will make certain marginal adjustments. Continuously, they have been promoting the idea of self-regulation by co-opting civil society into things like Santa Clara Principles, Manila Principles. These are all multi-stakeholder bodies, including the OECD, with some of these big tech companies, which come and say, we will make our algorithms truly discrimination-free or bias-free. But that will really not help. As the Dalit movements have pointed out, invariably, when Dalit movements flag content that is anti-Dalit, the time that Facebook takes to take it down, this happens with the Kisan Mukti Morcha, right? Recently, last week, they issued an apology and all that. And they said, too bad, we took time, but they took it down. So the haste with which, the agility with which they respond to certain content, particularly coming from certain powerful forces in society, is very different from the way they respond to other kinds of content of people who are less powerful, or groups that are less powerful in society.
And I have an open question, like how a social media platform can identify the news from a propaganda or a narrative?
Um, oh, okay, when with open, you said either of us should respond, or?
Yeah, you can respond, Parminderji.
I think, Amita, it's easy for us to keep on recognizing that the world is bad and these are the problems, and do discussions over it and go home, without going to the root of what is the problem and therefore what changes can be made. And Anita alluded to when you asked the question about, is there a hidden agenda? The problem is, there is obviously not a hidden agenda. I mean, why would Mark Zuckerberg or any corporate head in India not try to maximize his profit? Because and even if he doesn't want to maximize his profit, the share capital system would make you maximize your profit. So it's very simple. And the questions even you now ask goes to trying to put private companies in roles which are not their roles. We should therefore be looking for who should be doing it, rather than, can Facebook be good? Can Facebook do this better? Why should they do anything better? I actually am a very strong believer in this way on a Milton Friedman's thing, that corporates are doing what they're supposed to do and make profit. That's fine. Somebody else should be doing it, and they are not doing it. And again, Anita alluded to something. We are civil society, because once we sit together, it's very easy for us to all sit together and say everybody else is wrong. But I want to point that civil society have had a problem. I and Anita are in this field for more than 10 years, 15. And we know how systematically civil society sided with corporations against the state, because once you are in a big fight, you have to balance the power of the state and the corporations, and both how they sided with the corporations against the state to talk about self-regulation. They'll be good. Today I was reading an article which says Google says, the Google researchers should not show Google in a bad light. And the article was criticizing it. And that makes me really feel bad. I mean, why were you expecting Google not to tell its researchers to not put Google in a bad light? No, these kind of formulations which have happened to us have to be taken away. It's like any other company, like a Shell or a car making company. They're supposed to make cars. It's the regulation which will say you can't cause pollution, your engines have to be like this, you can't speed over this thing, you have to have airbags. And for that to have, we have to bring in the state. And to bring in the state, we know there is a problem, because state comes in and it has its own agenda with data. But then we need to deal with it. We need to bring in the state, see how it can fulfill the roles which state has, and then how civil society fulfills the roles to hold the state democratically accountable. So most of the questions which we ask from Facebook, we should ask from ourselves, and ask for what kind of system should be doing it. We shouldn't even keep on saying, why doesn't Facebook do this? Why doesn't Facebook do that? I mean, I know I'm taking a very extreme position, but that is how I see it.
Okay, Parminderji, like, so you're trying to say that the corporations, the social media houses, they should not do anything to identify the false news from propaganda, false news from the actual news or truth.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying something bigger. We should not put the responsibility on them to do which other people should be doing. They should do it in the same way uh, Mercedes-Benz makes good cars. They don't want to lose public relations exercise. They don't want people to think bad about their cars. They will do that. And on that also, we can nudge people. So nudge Facebook. I'm not stopping you to nudging Facebook. But when we put all our effort and all our, uh, all our stake into having Facebook good, I mean, I feel very bad. I keep on hearing people, why hasn't Facebook taken off that content or should take down that content? And I really feel afraid about asking state Facebook to do it. Let's talk about India. Now, let's say, or India or a Latin American country where there is, say, so-called a leftist revolution taking place. Immediately, Facebook will be starting to take down content on many of its, this is violent, this is not following community standards, whatever. Do you really want Facebook to do all that? Is a question. But if you keep on telling Facebook, why did you do this? Then Facebook is going to come back and tell you, I mean, you asked me to do it, then I do it, then you find faults in it. So what should I do? So I'm really saying they need to be stronger, public, accountable, constitutional institutions to do much of the work which we expect Facebook to do. I'm not saying we should not expect Facebook to do those things.
Okay, so there should be a regulatory body, a government regulatory body that should kind of monitor the post made on Facebook. Am I right?
Yeah, I think, but Anita can go ahead. But no, it's much more complex because I know immediately you will say that that body would itself monitor only posts in a manner which is pro-government and other ones would not. No, so this is something much more complex, but I'll come back on it. But maybe Anita wants to say something.
So actually, this question is a very hard one because it's perpetually really about, the free speech versus censorship question, right? And there are no one can get it completely right, but I'm going to attempt to lay down what is the expert understanding about the situation. There is already, as I pointed out, self-regulation by social media companies, and those self-regulatory standards are published by social media companies like Twitter, like Facebook, etc. And these big companies publish these because these community standards are their benchmarks based on which they take down content. So if you actually refer to a person as an animal, or you call somebody a nigger, or you call somebody something, then that content is anyway taken down by Facebook. The second thing is there is a notice and takedown regime where such a content that is identified as something that goes against the community standards is flagged as, you must have seen that those messages, right? You receive a particular notification which says this content has been taken down based on the community standards policy. You can protest it, or you can have it restored by saying, you're mistaken, your algorithms are wrong, this is not what was meant, and it might be restored or not. In addition to that, there is certain legislations in every country that prevent certain forms of content from being there, which may go back to traditional censorship or traditional content regulation laws. For instance, in India, there is a judgment, Sabu Mathew case. So for instance, I can give you an example of advertisements about sex-selective abortions in India. No content on sex-selective abortions can be advertised. No child pornography can do its rounds on Indian media. Therefore, these pre-existing legislations also serve as regulatory standards. What I was talking about when I showed you the report from Germany, which is called the Facebook Transparency Report for Germany under the NetzDG law, is that over and above these kind of self-regulatory standards and pre-existing legislation, these days, governments have started thinking about fake news, misinformation, etc., and they're coming up with laws. So Germany did this, and it's about 2 years old. And one way to enforce this is to say, You have to show in your transparency report as a social media company on what grounds, if 100 people complained about propaganda, how many did you take down? How many did you not take down? So this kind of accountability is very, very important, because taking down or not taking down is not for me to decide as a social media company. In Germany, there is a regulation prevents you from having anti-Semitic sentiments. So there is a rule that any propaganda that is anti-Jew has to be taken down, and complaints have to be taken seriously. In India also, we have guidelines which go back to the IT Act, called the Intermediary Liability Guidelines. Those are being modified in the misinformation, fake news era. But what I think civil society and free speech liberals are always afraid of is there will be a collusion between political power and social media power. And therefore, content that goes up and content that gets taken down, and that entire politics will really be based on status quoism, right? We also can look outside in the world. For instance, New Zealand has a very complex system as to how content is regulated, in its decent communication law. It's called Decent Communication Act or something like that. So there are very many ways to balance this, and law is extremely important to lay the grounds for frivolous acts by state authorities so that citizens' rights can be ensured. But suffice it to say that pre-existing legislation is currently not doing justice to this complex scenario, and we do need new constitutional principles. For instance, civil society in Brazil was defending a lot of their traditional rights when the current government was passing its bill on fake news and misinformation. It is a delicate dance, but we really need to be sure that in a public sphere where free speech invariably means speech by some who are powerful, and free speech does not mean free speech for all, we really have to act in extremely responsible ways as a democracy to check the power of social media companies.
Okay. There are some regulations, like you mentioned, there are regulations in Germany. Similarly, there are regulations in Europe to prevent data privacy, and there are regulations in California. So, is there any kind of regulation in India apart from the IT Act you have just mentioned?
So we're talking about two sides, right? Privacy is an issue which infringes on people taking away information about myself that I do not particularly want to share in the public domain, right? That's a very important part of how I would like to appear in the public, so that I'm not harmed. The second is to ensure that the structure and quality of public deliberations and the public sphere is maintained in a way that there is diversity, plurality, and democratic voice that is inherently built into the structures of the public sphere. Both are two sides of the coin, and we need laws to be sure, because finally that ingredient called data is what is driving the intelligence economy, right? The social media companies are able to harvest data for intelligence. So we do need laws that can ensure that no harm comes unto me because of something that is personal, that is information I don't want to share, that is taken away from me. Similarly, laws are equally needed to ensure that consolidation of social media companies, the kind of monopolization that is taking place of the players in the media sphere. There is no distinction between social media and media. Today, media is social media. Many Pew Research Center in the US showed a couple of years ago that most people, 55% of Americans, consume their news through Facebook. And equally in the left and in the right, both ends of the spectrum. Similarly, Learn Asia, which is a South Asian think tank, conducted research in different parts of South Asia and Southeast Asia. People actually consume news from Facebook. They don't even consume news directly from news sources. So in some sense, I think we're talking about preserving a vibrant democracy and preserving the rights of the individual and of social groups not to be violated. And both have to go hand in hand. We don't have laws on either at this point in time, but we are hoping that the personal data protection law will become a reality, and it will be radical enough so that in my state, Karnataka, farmers' data is going to be part of a business proposition. And all it says is consent has to be obtained. We know that consent is a big game, and it's really, falsifies the idea of informed human engagement in debates, right? There is no such thing as consent. And feminists will tell you that consent is really a fiction. So I think that data laws for preserving democracy and the public sphere, they have to go hand in hand.
Okay. Thank you, Anitaji. We also have some guests among our panel. So I would request any of the panelists to, if they have any question from Parminder ji or Anita ji.
So the general question to either one of Barminder or Anita actually, are there any alternate medium you suggest actually, and other than the mainstream mediums? No, generally we talk about the WhatsApp being now being monitored. Actually, people are started using the Signal or Telegram. So like that, are there any alternate mediums? Can the the progressive forces or whatever the name we call and the marginalized communities can use without being attracted much by the agencies?
Yeah, so Guru, I think, yes, I mean, you named them, and it's easy to also find out. I mean, even if you search, you'll know the information which you asking us. So I think that's easy. I mean, these are the things, and this is how it works. If that's alone your question, I mean, that's easy answer. But I think the problem, and I don't expect it to be solved over 1 hour of conversation, and the little I and Anita can convey here is that we need to see problem in, while we can't not see the problem in the small ways which it directly affects us. For example, for an activist, whether there's a government snooping and he wants to or she wants to change the channel of communication. Of course, that's important. I'm not taking it away. But we also systematically face a systemic problem of what is the nature of social media, what are the cultural behaviors which have arisen around social media, what is the balance between corporate power and government power, and what kind of, as what we use as digital infrastructures we have to create. I know as I answer this narrative which I'm now making has gone too far away from the question you asked, but I may as well say that the question you asked is easily answered by Google as well. And I mean, better than I can do right now if you spend 20 minutes. So, so therefore, I'm not putting your question away. What I'm saying is, and my thinking about civil society actors is that we have taken too much of an attitude which actually helps the corporations. Because, and I'm not trying to bat for state power here. I mean, I spend all the time to fight against state authoritarianism. But as new systems are constructed, if we keep on being afraid mostly of the state power, which we should be, and this has allowed the corporations, and I was earlier telling a lot of civil society just being fighting on one side, which is against state power, has helped create the Facebooks, Googles, etc. We need to create a balance, and therefore bigger conversations, which each of us cannot do. We are working in different areas, but I think we need to know. I mean, it was the questions I seen Ankit had written about, safety of Aadhaar data, safety of, you really go to physical examples. Sometimes physical examples are very useful. Do you really think that your house is safe when you lock your house and come out to the market? Is it safe because of your lock? Do you think, Guru or Ankit, that your house is locked, safe for the lock? No, it is not. I have worked in some kind of areas where I know how the best lock takes about 7 minutes or 8 minutes to break. Any kind of lock, any kind of railing, etc. I mean, it takes 10 minutes to break. Your houses are not safe because you have locks. Your houses are safe because there are institutional public systems which create that safety, right? People they're not burglars in your house so often as they could be because there are systems. Same, we tend to individualize the problem. In that way, we are accepting the neoliberal narrative, each of us, by individualizing the problem. My data, my Aadhaar, my Telegram, which are, again, I'm saying important, but we have stopped responding to the systemic, the public structures, public systems part of this equation. And my small message in a very long lecture is that we need to systematically start seeing in the new world what would be the digital large systems, where would be the role of public, community, accountability, democracy, apart from the small problems, or not the small problems, the immediate problems which we face. I'm sorry, it's too all over the place, but that's my honest answer.
Yeah, understand.
Thank you,
So
Parminder.
maybe little unrelated question actually. So I see that in the Western countries, particularly in the US, no, the radio is picking up, internet radio and other thing that's becoming the alternate medium for the. I mean, the lot of people use the internet radio, and because I don't see much regulation happening in that space actually. Do you think that the trend is going to happen in India? But,
Yeah, no, internet radio. Actually, I don't know. You guys do it. The day before yesterday, I downloaded this app of Punjabi, all Punjabi songs, stations all over the world, and I was so excited because I have this Bose system and I have a phone and I can play any radio. I mean, I can play Kirtan happening in Vancouver Gurdwara right now, sitting at my home. So I think this internet radio has a great potential. What is the potential of it vis-a-vis? I mean, I think probably you're more interested in voices of resistance, voices which are alternative. I think there are a huge amount of possibilities there. But we should not, and I always insist in my advocacy, go so much towards the alternatives and the corners that we leave the middle to be taken away by the big guys. We have
that's
to
right.
fight for the middle.
Yeah.
Never leave the middle, because middle is which we may, have this thing about activists and have fancy, special. I mean, I only don't use Microsoft. I use only open free software. But that becomes a fanciful thing. But we are activists not on our own behalf. We are activists on the behalf of 1.3 billion people of India, or probably 7 billion people of the world. So we cannot cede the middle as we also look at alternatives. And I think that internet radio and many kind of, and Anita was talking about the new possibilities of federated platforms, which, but if you want to push the federated platforms away from the corners, more towards the middle, a relationship with the government has to be established. Only the public systems are strong enough to fight back corporate systems, especially the current corporate systems who are global, right? So you need to create a situation where the alternatives are assisted by institutional support from governments, but it is done in a manner that governments are not able to day to day come and interfere. I mean, we have actually talked in our organization of data constitutionalism. We talk about digital constitutionalism. We think that data and digital should be kind of a fifth pillar of the state, and it's so much protected constitutionally. I think that kind of thing, and it can't be done right away, but just trying to put your minds in that direction. That's the small message we're giving.
Yeah, makes sense.
Thank you, Parminderji. I have a last question. We are also running out of time. I think it's not right to say about ethical and unethical. Like if you browse something on Google, and say if you're searching for a doctor, then after a few seconds you receive a message, either a text message or a WhatsApp message from like prospective doctors or the field you're searching for. So you don't want to share your number, but still I think they are extracting that information from you. So I want to know, like, is there anything happening in terms of data privacy in India, in terms of policy regulation or something?
Enough is not happening. And last thing, I'll let Anita also speak for a minute and I speak. I think my problem again is, and I tend to be a very solution minded person. And if I talk to civil society actors, I try to tell them what we should do rather than, tell what Trump should be doing, which is very easy to say. I think we need to begin engaging for public systems who, as I was saying earlier, your protection, physical protection is not through your lock. It is through the public systems. In the same way, if somebody enters my house, he is sent to the prison. Why somebody who takes data and gave it to the person who's sending the messages to you, right? The ones you don't want to receive, should just simply be taken to prison. I mean, we need to be saying that data is like a part of my leg or arm or something. My data is a part of my body. And if somebody misuses it, this is how it is. If somebody slaps you in the public, there's a law against it, right? And actually there is imprisonment. It may not be cognizable, but if there's a small blood on your face, then it's cognizable. So we need to get into those kind of legal systems. That's the only way I think we can really proceed. Maybe Anita has something to say.
Okay.
And
Yeah, we are running out of time, so I would request any guest or the speakers if they want to say anything, the last comment or conclusion. Okay, I think that will be all. So, like, let me conclude let's summarize the entire session. So basically, we I think had a productive discussion. We talked about firstly, like, it's not right to call our information as data. It is basically intelligence, and the companies are using this intelligence, of course, for their own to maximize their profits. And it is the present, I would say. The structure of society that we are all working to maximize our returns, maximize our interest, maximize our profits. So there's nothing wrong in that. The regulation, if you talk about regulation, the regulation should come from the government bodies. Like the respective countries has to make a certain norms and has to forcefully, I would say, enforce them so that the other companies, the social media companies, the digital media companies can accommodate that. And also I think we had a good discussion about, like, we also discussed about how Germany is enforcing this law of not allowing any anti-Jew post on on the social media. So we should take, I think, the leads from these pages. And in India we see that currently we see two a divided India. If we talk about CAA, we talk about Hathras incident, and we talk about this present farm protest. We saw two India. One India is pro-government, which says that these all people are anti-nationalist, that they have some their hidden agenda. They are this communist people who want to break in India. And if we talk about the other side, they are more like concerned about the incident. They want to talk that talk give impact effect. I'm sorry for that breakup. Um, but we saw divided India, and the if we are engaging in Twitter, we are engaging on Facebook, we see that the kind of choices we are making, the kind of post we are seeing, kind of affirming our beliefs in the present ideology. So as a country, India should also make some laws, a regulatory body to promote only the spread of true information and prevent from spreading of false information. On this note, I would like to thank Anita ji once again and Pravinder ji for being with us. And yeah, that will be all for today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Ankit.
Thank you.